my fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 21 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. We're still traveling on the cobblestones of the Roman Empire, watching history unfold and a tiny community of misfits transforming itself into what would become one of the greatest powers in history. At the very beginning, though, Rome had no power nor status. It was effectively a rejected community. Romulus's bold thinking, for the Roman standards at least, gained them settlers, women, territory, and a reputation. Romulus created a community with a cohesive structure, something which would prove extremely important in the future, and which would allow Rome and the Romans to overcome even the toughest challenges. Romulus had created a community which took pride in their military prowess. They were a nation of warriors, and each and every subsequent king, except for the second one, Numa Pompilius, followed Romulus's steps in expanding Rome's power in Latium. When we think about the Romans today, we almost always picture them as soldiers, marching along in orderly lines, ready to dig out an enemy camp in the span of some scant hours. The armor and their weapons are as known to us as if they were family heirlooms. In reality, though, despite their clear love for heated confrontations and propensity to solve things through war rather than diplomacy, the early Romans weren't that good as an army. The early string of victories was due more to the inferior level of their opponents rather than the Romans' superiority. They would evolve into the war machine we so dearly remember, but this would come at the cost of very hard work, their pride, and unfortunately, a lot of human lives. Before we start our journey today, I would like to explain how the next few episodes are going to work. When I started this deep dive into Roman history, I never meant for it to be a play-by-play of all events which had shaped the Roman Empire. If I'd wanted that, I would have created a podcast on Roman history. If you'd rather know about all the events that happened during the long centuries of the Roman Empire, then I suggest you look at the many great podcasts and channels out there doing exactly that. But if you're curious about the people who left their mark on Roman history, then come along. You're in the right place. I will still follow the chronological order, but rather than relate every event as it occurred, I'm going to focus on those heroes and heroines who, by shaping Roman history, have also shaped our own future. That said, let's pick up the narration where we left it. Right after the seventh and last king of Rome, the aptly named Tarquinius the Proud, was kicked out of the city and stripped of his imperium, cementing Rome's transition from monarchy to res publica. Let me welcome you, my fellow travelers, onto the path of the heroes of the Republic. If I were to ask you now if you knew any hero or heroine from this period of time, chances are you would just tell me no. If, though, I were to ask you this very same question once again at the end of this episode, your answer might have probably changed by then. Maybe you don't know or you don't remember their names. Maybe you never connected them with specific situations or deeds. But chances are that in your lives, you might have heard a torn phrase, an expression, a quote, an anecdote related to these characters. In my case, at least, as it's the case for most Italians, Roman heroes and their deeds are staples in our culture. Let's see if they have managed to permeate also yours. Following the disgraceful abuse that Sextus Tarquinius, Tarquinius the Proud's second son, had heaped over Lucretia, forcing her to take her life to spare her husband and their family the shame, the Romans decided that enough was enough. They had already forgiven their king for many a tyrannical act, but this was the final straw. Incited by Brutus, the people rioted, and the royal family faced the lynching mob. Tarquinius the Proud fled for his life, and the Roman people settled onto a new form of government. Rather than a single man in charge, 2 consuls holding power together and for no more than a year, as a way to stop anyone from attaining supreme power and abusing it. It was an interesting and novel idea, one which worked way better than what anyone had probably been expecting. The consular system held for basically half a millennium. It clearly had its ups and downs, and over the course of the decades some modifications were applied, especially at the beginning, when the plebeians wanted to have a say in the governments of the city. But the core principles and the basic structures held through the passage of time. It would take a man of Julius Caesar's caliber to even start shaking the system. Octavian Augustus would then transform it into something else, something very similar to the monarchy that Rome had tried so hard to avoid. But this change is still 500 years in the making from where we're standing now. For now, the res publica had moved its first wobbly steps in the void left by the monarchy. The 2 absolute protagonists of this change were the first 2 consuls, Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. The first one was the former king's nephew, while the second one had been poor Lucretius' husband. They hadn't been alone in organizing the coup and engineering the people's revolt against the Tarquini, but at the beginning only those 2 reaped the reward of their government shift. Lucretius' father, another conspirator, had only wanted revenge and had not been interested in a new political career, while Publius Valerius Publicolas' turn would come later. It's nice to think that conspirators share the same values and goals, but most of the time, people have different priorities and morals and decide to stick together only until the goals can be reached. This was the case with Brutus and Collatinus. While the latter clearly wanted revenge for the senseless death of his wife, the former's desires might have been a little more politically focused. There's nothing solid on this, no place where it's clearly written that Brutus might have been aiming for the throne when he started the conspiracy, but there are enough hints through the sources that, at least in my opinion, this can be considered a plausible theory. According to one anecdote, one day Brutus accompanied his cousins to the Oracle of Delphi. The question that the king's sons had asked the oracle had been which of them would inherit the throne. The oracle answer had been a rather cryptic, whoever kisses their mother first. We're told that the princes interpreted the oracle literally and waited to come home and kiss their mother, although we're not told who was faster. But Brutus had opted for another interpretation. He thought that the mother was the goddess Gaia, literally Mother Earth, and so he had pretended to trip to kiss the ground. This is my own personal theory, but I'm honestly convinced that Brutus had never intended to found a republic. He just wanted his uncle and cousin out of the way so that he could take the throne. That didn't happen, and so Brutus made do with the position of consul. If you're wondering why, after having expelled the entire royal family, Brutus was not only allowed to remain, but was also chosen for the prestigious position, it was because he'd carefully presented himself as slow-witted over the years, as not to be seen as a potential political enemy. In the end, he got the last laugh, so I guess the strategy worked. As a consul, the first thing he did was to make the people swear an oath that they would never allow another king in Rome again. If you think Brutus did it because he was a staunch Republican, very fed up with the monarchy, you're free to do so. I personally think it was more of a if I can't become king, nobody will kind of thing. In any case, the point may be moot, for modern historians are not entirely sure Brutus really existed in the first place. As you might have expected, Tarquinius the Proud didn't particularly appreciate being booted out of his own city and stripped of his royal rights. Having fled to Etruria to look for allies and recoup, it didn't take long for the 7th king of Rome to try and regain the city. Fresh out of an army in that moment, Tarquinius the Proud tried bribery first to regain the throne he had lost. He decided to send ambassadors to the Senate. This was ostensibly to request the return of some of his personal property, which had been confiscated upon his exile, but in reality it was a not-so-subtle attempt to bribe some of Rome's leading men into switching sides. Despite the people's uproar, the king's expulsion had been far from unanimous in the Senate. Some nobles had seen nothing wrong in the way Tarquinius the Proud had ruled, and many a royalist was willing to help in getting his throne back. Unfortunately for Brutus, some of them were also part of his family. 2 of his wife's brothers and both his sons, Titus and Tiberius, had taken the former king's side, and most importantly, his bribes. When the plot was discovered, all implicated men were put to death, and Brutus was forced to choose between his love for his family and his loyalty towards the newly created Respublica. We're told that Brutus chose Rome and condemned both his sons to death. His stoicism in watching his son's execution gained him the respect of the people, but he was also human, and he did show at least some emotion as the sentence was carried out. Extreme sacrifices, whether personal or of family members, for the sake of Rome, are something which will come up fairly constantly during the history of the Roman Empire. Such abnegation and willingness to give up everything for the fatherland are almost seen as required virtues for any man aspiring to be a Roman hero. And if the reality couldn't provide them, historians have always been quick to assign them to their favorite heroes. For the sake of Rome, Brutus chose to sacrifice his legacy, so it's understandable that when his co-consul Collatinus didn't offer up the same amount of abnegation and willingness to uphold justice, this sparked up some resentment between the two. It's also possible that, by this point, Brutus carried a deep and encompassing hatred for the entire gens Tarquinia and all its members, and since Collatinus' full name was Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, such hatred extended to him as well. Whatever the reason, Brutus didn't waste time, and had Collatinus removed from his post and Publius Valerius Publicola elected in his stead. In the meantime, the failure of his bribery told Tarquinius the Proud that war was his only choice to get the throne back. Since he still possessed no army of his own, he allied himself with the Etruscan cities of Veii and Tarquinia, and used their armies to march on Rome. Ready to end the conflict as soon as possible, Brutus wasted no time and levied an army which met Tarquinius the Proud on the battlefield. In his role as general of the cavalry, Brutus squared off with his cousin, Aruns Tarquinius. In the battle that followed, the 2 cousins charged at each other and speared each other to death. While the result hanged in the balance for most of the conflict, in the end the Roman army prevailed and routed the Etruscans. The Senate tributed the triumph to the remaining consul, Valerius Publicola, and he organized a lavish and magnificent funeral for Brutus. It's said that the Roman matrons mourned him for an entire year for his role in exacting vengeance for Lucretia. And so ends the life of the first hero of the new Roman Respublica. Did the death of one of his sons and the defeat of his army end Tarquinius the Proud's ambitions? Absolutely not. If the cities of Veii and Tarquinia weren't enough to go against the might of Rome, then it simply meant that the former king needed to find a better ally. Thus he turned to the king of Clusium, Lars Porsenna. Porsenna is another of those semi-mythical figures, and while there isn't a lot of hard evidence to go around, historians seemed convinced that he might have existed after all, just without most of the stories which had made his figure so known for the Romans. In this moment of time, Porsenna was the strongest Etruscan ruler, a very good choice for the ambitions of Tarquinius the Proud. Probably enticed by the possibility of conquering what had been, until that moment, the dominant power in the area, Porsenna consented to help the former Roman king regain his throne. What he actually did to achieve this and how he helped Tarquinius the Proud are, unfortunately, things we don't really know. The sources that we have, mostly Livy basically, were more concerned by the acts of Roman bravery than with what Porsenna really did, so we have only a partial reconstruction of the events. What we do know for sure, at least according to the Roman historians, is that Porsenna was so impressed by particular acts of Roman bravery that, in the end, he simply decided to offer peace to the Romans and go back to Clusium. According to a minority of historians, Porsenna did manage to partially subdue the city, but he didn't seem inclined to give it back to Tarquinius the Proud. If anything, we get the feeling that Porsenna wanted to keep Rome for himself. In this case, we're going to follow the majority of the historians of old, and we're going to go with the version where Rome's virtue was saved by the courage of her citizens. 3 in particular demonstrated such courage and abnegation that their actions were enough to impress even Porsenna. The first of them was an officer in the army by the name of Horatius Publius Cocles. His name, Horatius, makes him part of the legendary family of the Horatii, who'd already produced 3 heroes in Roman history. His moment to shine came as Porsenna was laying siege to the walls of Rome. That the king of Clusium had come this far speaks highly of his military capability, making the accounts that he had, in fact, gotten very close to subdue the city much more credible. In 509 BC, at the head of his army, Porsenna had already seized the Janiculum Hill and was on his way to cross the Pons Sulpicius, the only bridge crossing the Tiber. The Romans decided that keeping the bridge was paramount and rallied to defend it. When the 2 armies came face to face, it was clear that Porsenna had the Romans outnumbered. Still, the Romans didn't back down, and war started. In a display of great military strength, the Etruscans immediately gained the upper hand and wounded both consuls on the field. Their forced retreat from the battle sent the Roman army into a panic frenzy, with the soldiers making a mad scramble towards the Sulpicius bridge. While the majority of the Roman soldiers routed, 3 stood their grounds on the bridge. Among them was the young, and until that moment unknown, Horatius. Sources tell us that the young Horatius' courage shamed even the 2 veteran commanders with him. When it became clear that they couldn't withstand the barrage of missiles coming their way, the 2 commanders decided to retreat and order Horatius to abandon the bridge as well. Knowing that if the bridge fell, there would be no stopping Porsenna from storming Rome, Horatius refused and ordered his men to destroy the bridge, with him still on it. Porsenna and the Etruscans were shocked, not only by this suicidal last stand, but also by Horatius' bold and slightly sacrilegious decision of using dead bodies as a shield wall. Still, they kept pelting the poor Horatius with arrows and javelins, and we are told that some of them found their mark, one famously embedding itself in his buttocks. When Horatius finally received word that the bridge was about to fall, he jumped, fully armoured in the Tiber, and swam to safety, emerging on the Roman side without having lost a single weapon. His valour and madness awarded him a crown of victory, and he was conducted through the city by a singing crowd. Since his bravery had costed him a leg and an eye, thus earning him the nickname Cocles, meaning one-eyed, Horatius was given as much public land as he himself could plough around in one day, and each citizen was to give him one day's ration of food. He was also honoured with a bronze statue, although nowadays historians think it was originally a statue of Vulcan, which was then taken for Horatius when the attribution to the god became unclear. According to the sources, Horatius' actions stymied Porsenna's direct assault on Rome, paving the way for the peace treaty that would follow. While his actions were suitably heroic, and his name is on every chronicle and history of the res publica, even in antiquity there were some doubts about them. Livy himself viewed the story as nothing more than a legend, describing Horatius fully clothed swim into the Tiber, and I quote, as an act of daring more famous than credible. So, with Horatius Cocles' credibility in the balance, who were the other two heroes who stopped Porsenna in his tracks? The second guy was called Gaius Mutius Cordus, and if the name doesn't tell you anything, then you're in good company. Maybe, though, if I were to add his later cognomen, things might become clearer. After his encounter with King Porsenna, he became known as Scaevola, meaning the left-handed. How did he come about with such a name? We need to go back for a moment to Horatius Cocles' actions. While he had bravely defended the bridge, this had only slowed down Porsenna's army, transforming what should have been a direct attack on the walls of Rome into a prolonged siege. It's during that siege that Mutius' story comes about. In a bid to break the siege, Mutius snuck into the Etruscan camp one day, after having gained the approval of the Roman Senate, and attempted to murder Porsenna. Unfortunately for him, either the Etruscan king was slightly paranoid, or there was no custom in Etruria to dress their leaders in different clothes. For whichever reason, the day in which Mutius snuck into Porsenna's camp, it was payday for the Etruscans, and the king was on a raised platform speaking to his troops. The only problem? There was another man there, most probably his attendant or a scribe, dressed exactly like him. With no other clues about each other man's identity except how they were dressed, Mutius had a 50-50 chance of hitting the right man. As he stood over the body of the man he had just killed, it turned out that the poor Roman had made the wrong choice. He had killed the innocent scribe and not the Etruscan king. Of course, he was immediately seized, and when interrogated by the king about his act, he boldly declared he was but the first of 300 Roman youths who had volunteered for the task of killing Porsenna at the risk of losing their lives. At this point, Porsenna realized that he needed to nip this threat in the bud immediately before the next 299 volunteers descended on his head, so he condemned Mutius to a very public death. It's told that when Mutius heard of his fate, right in front of Porsenna's bewildered eyes, he stuck his right hand into a sacrificial fire that had been burning in the brazier next to him. More shockingly, though, was the fact that he kept his hand in the fire until it was burned down to nothing, boldly declaring that this was how cheap the body was to men who had their eyes on glory, and then refusing to utter another sound. These actions are said to have shocked Porsenna so much that the king dismissed Mutius and sent him back to Rome with the words, "Go back, since you do more harm to yourself than me." After that, the Etruscan king sent ambassadors to Rome, offering peace, probably weirded out by the sheer amount of lunacy he had just witnessed. Muzio's actions and bravery earned him a new cognomen, Scaevola, the left-handed, and a decent amount of farming land on the right-hand bank of the Tiber, which might sound like a poorly thought-out joke. You know, he had just lost his right hand, but in reality it was quite the honour, since Romulus and Remus had been found encircled by the she-wolf on the right-hand bank of the Tiber. Scaevola's actions, though, didn't just grant him land and fame during his lifetime, but they crossed the barrier of time and immortalized him and his sacrifice in a particular saying that in many European languages is still used today. I would stick my hand into the fire means that you're so sure about something, like Muzio Scaevola had been about killing Porsenna, that you don't care about the consequences you bring upon yourself. Interestingly enough, in Italian you can say, I would stick my hand into the fire, to indicate you're very sure, but the saying is more used in the reverse, I wouldn't stick my hand into the fire, to indicate you're not so sure about something, at least not enough to cause damage to yourself. And so Horatius Cocles had slowed down Porsenna's impetus, thus saving Rome's walls, and Muzio Scaevola had brought about peace talks with his reckless action. What about the third hero who stopped Porsenna in his tracks? Well, for one, she was a heroine by the name of Clelia. The actions of the other two Roman heroes had brought about a peace treaty, which had ended the war between Rome and Clusium in the year 508 BC. As part of the conditions of the peace treaty, Porsenna had asked to be given some Roman hostages. One of them was a young woman named Clelia. We don't know much about her except for her name and the deed that brought her fame. There are two versions of the story. Both, though, recount her daring escape from Porsenna's clutches along with a party of other girls. According to the first one, as the female prisoners were led to a river to bathe, Clelia persuaded the guards to stand a little further away to preserve their modesty and used this chance to escape with the other girls by swimming across the river towards the Roman part. In the second version, the escape was a bit more daring. According to historian Valerius Maximus, Clelia escaped on horseback with a party of other virgins, and as she came to the river, she bravely swam across, even through the barrage of missiles the Etruscan soldiers were pelting her and her girls with. In both cases, she reached the Roman shore safely, with all the girls accounted for. Upon hearing of her escape, Porsenna immediately demanded her return, probably with the intention of making an example out of her. A little later, though, we are told that the Etruscan king changed his mind, deciding that her deeds were as worthy of admiration and respect as Cocles and Scaevola's had been. So, rather than demand her return with the intention of punishing her, he asked that she would be given back to him, promising to send her back to Rome once again, safe and inviolate. To incentivize the Romans to comply, Porsenna added that if Clelia wouldn't come back, he would regard the peace treaty as broken. With a commendable display of courage and abnegation, Clelia went back, and Porsenna did keep his word. Upon her arrival, she was praised for her courage, and she was rewarded with the possibility of choosing half the Roman hostages to be released. It said that she chose the young boys, as they were deemed the most at risk of abuse. For her bravery and her heroic deeds, the Romans gave her the unusual honor for a woman of a statue of herself mounted on a horse. Clelia would become the only woman in Roman history to be celebrated like this. And Porsenna? The sources tell us that after witnessing such brave acts from the Roman people, the Etruscan king decided to withdraw from the war and leave Rome. Not only that, Porsenna also left behind as a gift to the Romans his stores of provisions. According to the Roman historians, he did so to reward the bravery, but maybe he just wanted to leave the Roman lunacy far behind as quickly as possible. To his credit, he did try one last time to install Tarquinius the Proud back on the throne, as he'd been asked to. In 507 BC, Porsenna sent ambassadors to Rome requesting Tarquinius' restoration to the throne, The Romans politely answered that they would never readmit that tyrant and that Porsenna should stop sticking his nose into someone else's business. At that, the Etruscan king agreed and told Tarquinius the Proud to go and spend his exile elsewhere than Clusium. And that was how the war between the Romans and Porsenna ended. Was it enough to stop Tarquinius the Proud from wanting his throne back? Of course not. So what if Porsenna had proven himself unreliable? All the former king of Rome had to do was find another ally to help his cause. His final attempt to regain the city is said to have come more or less a decade later, when the elderly Tarquinius persuaded his son-in-law, Octavius Mamilius, dictator of Tusculum, to march on Rome at the head of a Latin army. The ensuing battle was hard fought on both sides, and the Roman narrowly came out on top, after having slain Mamilius and wounded Tarquinius the Proud, last remaining son. After such a defeat, old, tired and out of allies, the seventh king of Rome spent his last years in exile at Cumae, thus ending Rome's monarchy forever. And with Tarquinius the Proud exit stage left, it's about time to bring the curtains down on this episode as well. The history of the Roman Republic is full of heroes and heroines willing to give up everything, limbs included, for their beloved city. What will follow will test the Romans to their limits, uncovering their weaknesses and bringing their dreams of glory almost to a complete stop. Rome will need all the courage of her citizens to weather the storms brewing on her horizon. Not all the people we'll meet lived up to such expectations, but all of them went down in history and legend for what they did, or failed to do. I will wait for you here, my fellow travellers, to continue our exploration of the courage and abnegation of the people who made Rome into the empire we still remember and love even today. In the meantime, I invite you once again to join me on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. And when you do, please say hi. I'm very happy to make your acquaintance. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfoli, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.